Hey.
Hi. Welcome.
And
I'm so excited that we're doing this.
me too.
Should we start with a couple of breaths to the ground?
Yes.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay.
Are you gonna lead us?
Yeah, I'll lead us.
Okay.
So eyes can be open or closed. Letting our next breath in draw our attention inward. Start to notice what's here for you. Feeling the way our bodies are connected to the chair underneath us. Supported by earth underneath us. And then taking a breath in, open mouth exhale. And then twice more. Your own breath, your own pace. I really am trying to get in the habit of doing that with like every interaction that I have, because I feel like we just need that as humans, or at least I definitely do.
Yes, it's really helpful to get out of my head. Although I'm probably gonna be right back in my head here in a minute, but it's a good place to start.
Exactly. Progress, not perfection.
Right.
So just briefly to touch on this conversation series and why I wanted to do it. I think one of the things that's been so interesting about the recovery community so far is realizing that just the power of hearing another person's story is so profoundly helpful for people who are in recovery, whether you are new in recovery, have been in recovery for a long time. There's that kind of intimacy and relatability and a sense of, oh my God, I'm not alone. And actually there are other people in the world having the same experience. Like I remember before I got sober, I just didn't even know that other people lived sober lives. Like I didn't really think that was a thing. And I definitely didn't know anybody who would be open about those kinds of experiences. And so I think that a big part of wanting to start this conversation series is one, just to be able to offer a space in which people can come and feel connected and feel like they're not alone. And then also really to destigmatize. Like I think that there's still such a stigma around addiction and recovery and what that means. And really, we live in the most addicted society in the world in history. And so it's like, if you're not an addict yourself, or you know somebody close to you who is, and so just really normalizing that this is such a human experience and not necessarily something to have to feel shame about. And I think so much of the shame comes from the fact that it just still feels really kind of hidden and in the shadows in a lot of ways. And so wanting to bring conversations into the light for people is a way to be supportive. So I'm so excited that you're here. And I thought that we could just start and you could share as much of your story as you feel called.
Okay. Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for asking me. It's an honor. And of course, my first instinct was like, I'm not qualified, which is so, and we've talked about this before, that sort of like imposter syndrome, and fear of being seen and judged and all the things. And I'm definitely qualified. That's a lie. That's a lie. I've told my story so many times, but just not in this platform. So, yeah, but I also love what you said about the destigmatizing, because I feel like we hear about addiction a lot and we hear stories of addiction a lot, especially in the media. It can be like glorified in some ways or looked down upon in other ways, but we don't hear stories of recovery a lot, and that's not openly talked about as much. So I do think it's really important. And yeah, so okay, so my story. So I guess I'll just start at the beginning and thinking about what it was like as a child. For me personally, I always, from like my first memories as a child, I felt really uncomfortable in my own skin and just anxious, and like things didn't feel okay for no apparent reason. Like my earliest memory is a memory where I just felt really uncomfortable and really not okay, and there was nothing actually going on that was harmful to me. And I don't think that that makes me an addict or an alcoholic or anything. But what happened was, as I, began to grow and develop as a girl, I became increasingly more uncomfortable in my body. And I'm starting to become more and more aware of that as we do these embodiment practices, of just how much I felt like my body had betrayed me, starting from development, like growing boobs and be like, what, this, I'm not ready for this. Like, and trying to cover up and hide, and, and, and then I found substances, and so was introduced to alcohol in middle school. And I think these days that's probably pretty common experience. It seems like kids are getting introduced to substances early and earlier. And I didn't have like any crazy experience right off the bat. Like I drank a little bit of, it was a mimosa at like a New Year's party, and I was too scared to get in trouble, so I didn't drink very much. So it was like not an exciting start at all. Um, but the second time I drank, I realized, I was with a group of women. I was with my basketball team actually, and it was like a lot of older girls, and I realized that this, it was liquid courage. Like I could be whoever I wanted to be when I drank alcohol, and it almost like it was a shield, that protected me from caring as much about what people thought of me, not being so concerned about my body, and being that awkward, uncomfortable person. And very quickly, I became a blackout drinker. And probably like 75% of the time I black out when I drink. And that was really scary. And I actually had an awareness pretty early on that like something was wrong. Mm. And the feeling that very quickly accompanied that was shame. And again, my body betraying me. Like, why can't I hold it together? Why can't I drink, like that person or that person? Or why do I keep waking up in bed next to strangers and not knowing like if we had sex or not? Or, and that happened a lot. That was a big part of my story and really contributed to the shame, was waking up, as like a 15, 16-year-old girl next to these men and not knowing what happened. And instead of being like, what the fuck, this person took advantage of me, I was like, wow, I'm a slut. And that became the narrative. I also think that kind of became like my reputation. And so it was sort of like I had this idea that I wasn't good enough, and that, it wasn't okay to be in my skin. And then that continued to be reinforced by what happened when I drank. And fast forward, what I learned when I got sober was that alcoholism addiction is often progressive for a lot of people, and it gets worse and worse. And that definitely happened for me. And it wasn't all bad. Like I had a lot of fun drinking, as I'm sure you did too. Sometimes, I wouldn't have done it if there wasn't some element of like fun and adventure and spontaneity and all of that.
Totally. Yeah. It's like, it's fun until it's not fun anymore.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And yes. And like high school was like some of the best memories I have, but always shame was always riddled throughout a lot of those experiences, and the underlying thing and the wanting to escape. And I remember, you know, I'd use others, like I'd smoke weed, and I didn't even like smoking weed. Like I was anxious and like paranoid, but it was better than existing in my own skin sober. I was like, well, this is like, you know, um, as good as it gets. And that makes me really sad to think about that now, you know, that like having to do anything to escape just being in my mind and my skin. And so my disease progressed, and I'll call it my addiction progressed, and I found other substances. And I should add, I think this is also a really important part of my story is from the time my body betrayed me by growing boobs, I realized that I got attention from boys and men, and that was another way to make me feel worthy.
Yeah.
And so I began to seek out that all the time. And I think we attract a lot of times, we attract wounded people that are wounded in the similar ways that we're wounded. And, you know, 10 years ago, I could have been like, fuck that dude, because he did this and that dude did this. And like, my whole story could be about all the dudes that wronged me. Uh, and now it's like, oh, they were just wounded like I was, you know, and I can see that a lot more clearly now.
Yeah.
But so I, you know, was in one dysfunctional relationship after another, and eventually was introduced to opiates and amphetamines. And my other sort of way of trying to feel worthy is um to play by the rules, um stay small, not take up space, please others, do what I'm supposed to. And so all of this time I did that too. You know, I went to school, and like in high school, I played sports, blah, blah, blah. I got decent grades. I went to college because that's what I was supposed to do. And so I had to look good, right? Like people didn't know how much I was really suffering.
Totally.
And I that's common for a lot of us.
For sure.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah. And that's so interesting too, right? Because I think it speaks to something that's really important, which is that an action can look the same on the outside, but it's really like the motivation behind it that matters. And so it's like you can do all the things, right? Like go to college and blah, blah, blah. And if it's coming from a place of like, oh, I really want to do this to grow as a person or whatever. And there's an element of that too, of course, but there's also that inside sort of job where it's like, okay, but I don't feel like I'm enough unless I do these things. And so that's such that process of inquiry of like, what is my true motivation for doing this thing is always so fascinating. I feel like before we get into recovery, so often the motivation is just coming from a place of like reacting to our insecurities as opposed to like choosing something because it genuinely feels in alignment with the way we want to be in the world.
yes, yes. The intention.
Mm-hmm.
And I had, of course, all of this is like hindsight, you know, at the time, I'm just going along doing what I can to survive, really. Um, and, you know, in that time period, I was in some pretty dysfunctional and abusive relationships. Um, and things got really messy and really scary. And I don't really feel a need to get into all the nitty-gritty of that. I'm sure people can imagine what it was like, or maybe they can't, but doing heroin and meth. It takes you to a really dark place. And I also want to mention, like, I've heard thousands of people's stories of recovery.
Mm-hmm.
I know true story is the same, but there's a lot of similarities. And something that I heard and was told when I got sober was listen for the similarities rather than the differences. And for me, that was really about what was going on in here,
Mm-hmm.
like you just talked about. Like the outside, yeah, it was intriguing to hear about what the sort of stuff that went down, of course. But what my heart connected to was those feelings of not feeling worthy and seeking connection and seeking something outside of myself to make the insides feel better.
Totally.
And so, um, at the end of my addiction, um, I weighed 40 pounds less than I do now. I just say that just for like a frame of reference. Like I was dying, I was sick and hollowed out. Like when I look at it, there's a few pictures of me from that time. And when I look at them, I'm like, it makes me so sad. I wasn't sleeping and I wasn't eating and I was running from shadow people quite literally. Have a little bit of PTSD from that. And my parents were so scared and begging me to get help, and I had no friends. And that's the other thing about addiction is that, like, it doesn't matter, it isolates us.
Mm-hmm.
And really what I've always wanted is to feel connected to others and connected to myself, and it took all of that away. And I remember like sitting outside and it'd be a full moon and I'd be like chain smoking cigarettes and looking up at the moon and like not having any sense of God or higher power or anything, but like praying because I was desperate and be like this isn't it. Like this can't be it. But having no idea what else there could be, what else that could look like and how to get out. And thankfully I had one friend left who's still my friend today, and she did something really important and she set boundaries with me and basically said like I wasn't allowed, you know, um, around her kids. And that was a big part of my bottom. And then it just a bunch of kind of drama. I kind of honestly, and people say like, oh, you have to get sober for yourself. And I just want to say, like, I don't think that's necessarily true. I think you have to stay sober for yourself. But I think there's a lot of ways that we can get here. And for me, my family kind of pushing me in, it was like, well, I don't really have anything else.
Yeah.
I don't really have any other options at this point. So like, I guess I'll go to treatment. And so I went to treatment, and that's when I was, what you said at the beginning of this, like having no idea that other people were getting sober. I had that experience too. I was like, what the fuck? Like young people are doing this. They like took us to outside meetings, and I remember one of my first meetings, there was like the room full of like 80 young people, and they were clapping and cheering and like seemed like stoked to be alive. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. And I had no idea. Um, and long story short, I moved into a recovery house. Um, well, I'll back up just a second and then I'll kind of wrap this portion up. But I did relapse after I got out of treatment. And what I attribute that to is that basically I wanted to do things. I didn't want to change anything in my life. I was just like, oh, I learned all these things and like, yeah, I want to be sober and like, let's do it. But I'm not ready to get rid of the boyfriend that's still using. And I'm like, going to go back to living where I was living. And I'm just going to do things kind of the way that I want to do them. And that didn't work. And I found myself in a situation where I didn't have the emotional capacity to get through it. And I was like, oh shit. and my drug of choice was available. And I was like, I don't want to get loaded. Like, I want to be sober, but I don't know how to do this. And I didn't have anybody available. And because I hadn't made those connections yet. And so I got loaded, and like, that was the worst period of time, like lying and, you know, lying to my family and wanting it and like knowing that it's an option, but like being stuck in that freaking hamster wheel again is the most miserable place you can be. And I know you've been there. Um, but and the other thing I want to say, so I was gifted with another opportunity at treatment. And the other thing I want to say is that like I am very privileged in the fact that I had access to treatment. And a lot of people don't. And there's this misconception out there that like, if you want to get sober, you can just go to treatment and get sober. And it's like, no, it's not that easy. Um, a lot of people don't have that option. And I feel really, really grateful. And I really try not to take that part for granted because I know that it's a privilege. And so I was able to go to treatment again, moved into a women's recovery house, was introduced to so many amazing women who really like took me under their arm and showed me the way. And I went through everything with them. Like, and that's a part that before I relapsed, I didn't do. It was like I still was in that isolation. It was like, yeah, I knew, okay, I could get sober, but like I needed other people to surround me, and I needed to learn about a higher power and have access to support and community. And I really believe that that's what saved my life. And continuing to do that is what keeps me sober and in recovery today. Um, so that's the quick version.
I know. I feel like it's always so interesting when we tell our stories because there really is. It's like there's a quick version and then there's like the hour-long version or the 2-hour-long version that also exists.
I didn't even talk about recovery, but like I think we'll get into that a little bit more.
Yeah, we'll get into it. Yeah. I think that hearing that process is just so helpful for people and the relatability and again just kind of taking the experiences that we have out of the shadows and I'm so glad that we get to do this and that you're willing to, and I also feel like it's important to say that I don't think that like every single person has to be sharing their story or should be sharing their story. Like that's such a personal decision. And if people don't want to kind of take their story out into a more public eye, like of course, like honor that that's the need. And I'm just glad that you have that willingness because undoubtedly it helps other people too.
Yeah. And on that note, actually made me think about, I also think in some ways it's a privilege to be able to do this too. Cause it's like, I've been telling my story to some degree. I'm pretty open about it, but I know that I'm not going to get fired from my job or somebody's going to discriminate against me because of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So true. Thanks for saying that. Yeah. Some people asked some questions from Instagram, and so maybe we can just talk about a couple of those.
Okay.
The first question that somebody asked is, what about your life today did you never imagine you could achieve?
That's a good question. Yeah, well, so what my life looks like today is I have a almost 2-year-old daughter who is just like the light of my life. We were laying in bed yesterday, me, her, and her dad. And she was hugging us and she like had her arm around both of us and was pulling our head to hers. And she was like, Mama, Dada, Indy, Mama, Dada. And she kept saying it. And I just had one of those moments where I was like, this is my life. Like, I just couldn't have even dreamed it to be this good, um but actually what resonates with me more with that question is I think some part of me I always wanted a family and, you know, like always wanted to be in sort of a helping profession. And deep down, I always thought that that could still be a possibility. But what I never imagined was feeling comfortable in my own skin and feeling confident, you know, being a confident woman with self-worth who can help other women find that in themselves and mirror that back to them. I never even knew what that looked like.
Totally. Yeah. For recovery.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. And that feels like such a gift because with that, you know, I get to first of all be introduced to people like you and be like attracted to people like you. Like I said before, I think, you know, we attract people that are wounded like us. And then as we, you know, grow into ourselves, I also think we attract people that are like-minded and on a similar spiritual path. And um I literally just lost my train of thought.
You were saying that with the getting sober, you also begin to attract people who are like-minded and on a similar spiritual path.
Oh yeah, okay. And so with that, with like embodying that I can really do anything, you know, like externally, like I can go back to school, I can have family, like all those things are possible because recovery has given me the ability to look inward and, you know, dive deep and uncover and discover the things that make me, you know, come alive and be have purpose in the world, you know, and it's all very interconnected in that way.
Totally. Totally. Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think that sometimes people, yeah, will have a question of like, oh, what are the things that you got as a product of your recovery, right? Or like, and then also on the opposite side of the spectrum, sometimes when people are maybe needing to get sober, but they still have like whatever, the house and the job and the whatever, they can be like, oh, well, I'm fine because I still have these things. And either way you slice it, it's like really the greatest gifts are the inside job part. And then everything else comes from that. And so, and that's also sort of what you were talking about before when you were saying about looking for the similarities, right? Where it's like, we can look at somebody else and be like, oh, they're not as bad as me, or oh, they're way worse than me because they do or don't have X, Y, or Z thing on the outside. And yet the similarity is always what's happening on the inside. And then to that tune, it's like the greatest gifts are really the things that are the shifts, like the tectonic shifts that happen on the inside as a product of recovery. And then the external becomes a reflection of that.
Yes. Yes. And on that note, I just want to mention that I haven't got it all figured out. And I don't always feel like this like strong, confident woman every day. It definitely probably at least once or twice a day feel pretty insecure in some way. But what recovery has also shown me is that like there's is to be teachable and that there's always opportunity to grow and evolve and like continuing to expand and knowing that it doesn't have to stay that way, you know, like there's so many tools I can use to continue to look at that and get relief from that really.
Totally. Yeah. 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 I appreciate you mentioning that because yeah, we're complex, dynamic, messy humans. And the point isn't to like be perfect or feel amazing all the time. It's more to have a deepened capacity to actually just hold what's really here and and be able to sit with the messiness that comes up that's so human.
If only everybody could have seen us right 2 minutes before this
Yeah.
started.
Totally. Yeah, for transparency purposes, I was trying to figure out just really the kind of best way to navigate this conversation. Do I do it on IG Live? Do I do it on Zoom? What's the best way? Blah, blah, blah. And then just coming, like having so many tech issues and questions and literally just scrambling up until 5 minutes before we were doing this and just like, I don't know what to do? And like feeling frozen, and then just being like, okay, fuck it, let's just do Zoom per the original plan. So yeah, that humanness.
Yeah.
uh, okay, so another question that somebody asked is, how do you stay sober when your heart is shattered?
Mm. Mm.
I know, totally.
Good question. Yeah. That's a good question, especially, I think a lot of us, okay, I'll speak for myself. Anytime before I got sober, anytime anything happened, it was an excuse to drink or use, right?
Mhm.
Good or bad, really. It was like, oh fuck, I'm like so hurt, or fuck this person or whatever. Like I'm a, get loaded and not feel.
Mhm.
And and on sort of in this realm, like the not feeling was really my goal all the time, because it was I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know what to do with it, and it was too overwhelming. And so first of all, it's such a one moment at a time process.
Mhm.
And I can just speak from my own experience that, I have gone through some really tragic things and since I've been sober. And one of those was my father's illness and subsequent passing away from Alzheimer's. And I remember the moment that I got the phone call and found out that he had early onset Alzheimer's. I was actually sitting in my bed at my recovery house, and I had my best friend was sitting next to me who also lived in the recovery house. And I remember getting the phone call and feeling like that instant feeling, that old feeling of like, oh, the feelings are rising and I need to shove them back down. Even though it's like, oh, this is fucking awful. Like, of course you should feel it. I probably should have done a disclosure that I cuss a lot, but like, we're already.
That's fine.
That's not
We're
what
setting a standard. I cuss a lot too, so it works out perfectly.
I do. And and then just allowing myself to feel it and crying and being like, and just having that person next to me being there. And I don't know what she said or what she did, but I remember that she was there and that I knew that I didn't have to go through it alone. And what I learned, he had Alzheimer's for 5 years until he passed away, and I helped take care of him. And it's such a sad disease because he just lost every part of himself. So it's this constant grief cycle, this constant heartbreak, day after day, week after week, month after month. And there was definitely moments where I was like, I don't want to do this. Like, I don't want to feel this. This is too hard. This is never ending. It's not getting better. It's getting worse. And I don't want to do it anymore. And, I had to crush up his pills for him and put them in his food. Like, I had every opportunity to not feel it if I wanted. But what I know about, from being sober long enough and is that you always have to feel it. Like, it doesn't matter if you want to numb it for a second, like it comes back 10 times harder, and that's just not worth it to me. And that grief is not linear, and that the moments where I've allowed myself to really be with the grief and give it space and honor it, that there is relief on the other side of that. Even if the heartbreaking thing is still happening, it's like, I like the word honor, like really honoring what it is I'm grieving. And there's this quote that's like kind of cheesy, but it's like, grief is the price of love, or something like that. It's the price tag that says we've loved, or something. And I believe that to be true. So in summary, having others supporting me and really allowing others to support me not running from it, because it'll always be there, and leaning into it as a way of moving through it.
Totally. Yeah, God, I feel like we could have just an entire conversation just about grief, and the experience of grief and recovery. And I appreciate everything that you said so much, and I totally agree. And it's tricky, right? Because when somebody is in grief, sometimes like being like lean into it is like not the thing that people want to hear. And I just think that it's so true. Like, I know from my own experience of grief that every single time as a person in recovery, I've chosen to lean in, which I only can lean in if I'm sober. And every single time I've chosen to lean in, one, it feels like one of the most empowering experiences you have as a person in recovery, because it's like you spend most of your life running so desperately from these feelings that just constantly dog you. Like, I lost people close to me when I was young, and I had no capacity to process that grief. And so I would continue to drink and use over it. For like 10 years, I did that because I was so afraid to turn around and just feel that, and so then you get sober, and it's like, oh my God, I can move towards these difficult feelings. There's nothing to run from. And it's like, it feels, you're like, this is like a superpower. Like, if I don't have to run from these feelings, then literally there's nothing to use over. And so it's such an empowering experience if we allow it to be. And I think that you're speaking to something so important, which is that feeling grief and giving it space offers us so many gifts. It's like, if I'm trying to be sober, it's because I'm trying to be as fully alive as possible and as fully free as possible. And unless I'm willing to feel the more challenging side of the spectrum of things, like, I'm not experiencing life fully, I'm not living fully, and I'm not fully free. Those things are keeping me chained, And so yeah, to get to lean in. And it really does feel, at least for me, like a get to at this point, where it's like, I get to lean into these feelings. I don't have to run from them anymore. And even though that doesn't necessarily make them easier to feel, and for sure I still have moments of resistance where I'm like, I don't want to fucking feel this. But at the end of the day, knowing from lived experience at this point and being able to trust what comes on the other side of that makes it so worth it.
Yes. 100%. And that's the thing, is like, grief is so different for everybody, the way that we navigate it. And there's no wrong or right way. And if somebody is grieving and they're, drinking or using or whatever, like, no judgment, 100% can say that from my heart. Like, I see that people are doing the best that they can to get by and survive. But the question was, how do you do that without staying sober?
Yeah.
And so just to be clear, that's my answer. And I have grieved not sober about really intense stuff, and I look back at that and I'm like, it was a shit show. And I carried it with me for so many years. Like you were saying, the freedom, like, it was a weight on me
Yeah.
that I talked about it all the time. Like, and this was a different, I guess, out of context, it sounds like it was a betrayal. It was a betrayal that was a deep grief for me. And like, had so much power over me.
Mm.
And the situation with my dad was definitely way worse and way more intense and way more important in my life. And it doesn't feel like a weight. It feels like still sad and obviously heartbreaking. And I have, my moments, of course, but I can access it. It's like, oh, it doesn't feel like it has so much power over me. And what happens in my life today, it's like I can access that as almost a resource of, like, I went through this thing and this is how I went through it and how I'm continuing to go through it, and it's a part of me, and I honor that.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. And then just going back to and reiterating again what you said about grief not being linear, and I think culturally people have this thing about grief, right? Where it's like, okay, oh, so this person in your life died, like take a week off work and then come back and be fine, right? And there's almost that expectation that we should grieve and then it should be done. And just, yeah, wanting again to really highlight that it's not linear at all. It's very much spiralic, and yeah, like I still will have moments of grief for things that have happened years ago, and it's like a really tender kind of allowance and a reminder for myself of like, there's nothing wrong with this, and that you're still feeling this or having this experience, and in fact I take that as a sign that I'm healthy.
Yes.
I take that as a sign that I'm healthy, that I have the capacity to honor what comes, and not have to put constraints around it, based on whatever the kind of societal norms or what we're taught tell us we should experience. And so, yeah, somebody said that to me a long time ago, and I've just never forgotten it, about like, if you're crying often, that like she takes it as a sign that she's like doing something correctly. I think there's actually a Glennon Doyle quote about that too, where she says like something about people ask me why I cry so often, and I say the same reason that I laugh so often, it's because I'm paying attention.
Yes, I love that.
I know, me too.
I'm starting to like do that thing where I'm like, wait, maybe that came out wrong, blah, blah, blah. So I just have to name one more thing that when I said that it doesn't have power over me, what I meant by that is that it doesn't have power to make me betray myself to escape
Totally.
feelings.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful. Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah, that's such an important distinction to make, because of course there's like power in it, right? But yeah, beautiful. Okay, so just to close, I'm kind of trying, hang on, I'm just going to feel into what feels the best way to close. Maybe just a couple moments to talk about how you understand your relationship to higher power or God or the divine today.
Okay. Yeah. So this is a concept that was really introduced to me when I got sober, or at least the verbiage and the language. And I think I had a lot of associations with those with religion, because in our Western American culture, that's up until probably more recently, that's really, I think, what we were taught and shown was Christianity. And so for me, when I was introduced to recovery, I was introduced to this concept of a higher power, and that basically it could be anything I wanted it to be, and that it was something that I could access at any time, and that it was something well, I was introduced to the idea actually that it was something outside of me, and now that's kind of changed. And the cool thing is it continues to evolve, as long as I allow it to. And so today, it's such a huge part of my life, and it's kind of like hard to talk about it because I don't have like an explanation of what it is. But to me, it's this inner sense of knowing or faith that I can kind of tell when I'm aligned, when I'm in alignment or out of alignment. And what I mean by that is that I have developed new values and spiritual principles that I live by. And so that can be things like, honesty, integrity, transparency, vulnerability, um, staying true to myself, not abandoning myself or connection with others, being of service, all of these things are really important to me today, and that I've learned through really other women in recovery. And so I can feel when I'm out of alignment with some of those, like, when you do something and you just feel like this pit in your stomach, or just like, it doesn't feel good, or interaction you had with somebody, you're like, I don't really like the way I showed up there. And you can go two ways. You can be like, but fuck it, they deserved it, da, 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 like, whatever, I'm gonna go on with my day.
Mhm.
Or it can be like, let's look at that a little bit. And to me, that's really where higher power comes in. It's like, that's the voice that's like, who do you want to be in the world today? How do you want to show up? How do you want to contribute? Yeah, okay, maybe that person didn't act right, but does that mean you want to change your values and what's important to you because of the way that person showed up?
Mhm.
And so really looking at like what's underneath that. And so having what that looks like for me is like putting pen to paper, looking at like that's something I learned early in recovery, was writing down, what's underneath that, what's the fear that's coming up, fear that I'm going to be judged, fear that I'm not good enough. And then do I owe that person amends? How can I tune in? Like right before we did this, we did a grounding exercise, which to somebody else might have looked like we were like I don't know, going crazy or something. We were like jumping up and down and like shaking our body. And Haley's like, "Whoa!" Like, um, we should have filmed that part. Um, but to me, that's like a spiritual practice. It's like, oh, how do I get back into my body? How do I center myself? How do I be connected to the moment? And that's really what my relationship with a higher power today looks like, is constantly, it's like meditation is also a part of my practice. And the principle of meditation, some people think is about clearing your mind, and it's not. It's really about coming back to the present, and staying true to myself. And again, we could have a whole hour on this conversation or longer, but we'll wrap it up there.
I know. Yeah. There's so much in all of it, and it's all so juicy. And yeah, we'll have to have another conversation at some point. Um,
Yes.
yeah, a question is just kind of coming to me to close, and that's if there was anything, like, I think something that we've both been taught as people in recovery is that, like, if our story reaches even one person, that makes it worth it, right? And I know for me that's been so helpful with this process, and like maintaining a sense of humility, that the hope is just to impact one person, right? And so kind of imagining that person, I'm wondering if there's like something that you would want to share or kind of close or leave them with in the way of inspiring hope and courage.
No pressure
Yeah.
on that question. No, it's a good question. Yeah. I think that people who struggle with addiction, from what I know, are very, generally speaking, usually pretty sensitive, intuitive people
Mhm.
who have big hearts and really just want to be connected.
Mhm.
And the thing that I would say is to reach out to somebody else. Like if you're struggling, to ask for help,
Mhm.
because I think that also our culture has this like pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and it's like that really is the first step, and was the first step for me, is like having enough humility and desperation to be like, I need help.
Mhm.
I cannot do this on my own. And the seed of connection is really planted.
Yes.
And greatest gift above all else, and I wish I could have talked about it more, is really like my ability to be of service today, particularly to other women.
Yeah,
Um,
feel free to expand on that.
there's something about when you suffer from not feeling worthy underneath all of that, and you meet another woman and she shares her story with you. First of all, the gift of somebody sharing their story with you in a really intimate way is like such an honor. And then you hear that they've also suffered from not feeling worthy, and you're like, oh, but you're just so amazing and beautiful and worthy, and I just see you as this like incredible being. It helps you see yourself differently too. um And if I got nothing else out of recovery but that, like those connections with women, that would be enough, honestly. And it sustains me. Like our relationship, for example, has been so impactful to me. You're probably like the only person I've seen through all of quarantine. um, and yeah, I'm getting a little bit off track, but what I would say is that the connection, it's scary. It's scary to be vulnerable. It's scary to be open. It's scary to be without substances when that's what you're used to, and to feel feelings. The amount of freedom that's on the other side is worth it beyond anything else I've ever experienced.
Yes, I can't, like when you say that, I feel in my body just like this rush of life force where I'm just like, oh, it's so true. It's just so true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Yeah.
What would you say?
Well, I kind of just lost my train of thought too, but you said something that sparked a thought in me. Let me just see if I can reach it again. You were talking about the connection and being worth it, and that it's scary to be vulnerable and scary to ask for help. And that's what it made me think of, is yes, 100% agree that it's terrifying. It's terrifying to do those things. And the question that I have asked myself, again out of like desperation, because otherwise I wouldn't do the scary thing, is like, what's scarier though, that doing that, or like coming to the end of your life and having lived like an unlived life? And to me, that is so much scarier than the momentary fear of asking for help or being vulnerable or doing the hard thing or making the amends or, admitting when you're wrong or whatever, just like all the practices that we have. And so, yeah, I guess that's the kind of question that I would leave with. And then, yeah, I mean, anything to add? I mean, I really think you hit it so perfectly, hit the nail on the head. I don't love that expression. I've been doing that a lot lately where I'll say something and I'm like, why do people say that? I'm kind of questioning, trying to be
it? Weird.
more intentional with my language. What'd you say?
Did you overthink it? Weird.
So weird. I never overthink anything. So, but what you said about the connection piece and the being willing to ask for help, I would say that's the thing that comes to mind for me too, because that's the biggest barrier of being able to kind of crawl out of the hole, is like the isolation. And I tried that, and I talked about this, but I tried that for so many years to try to do things on my own and do things without help from other people, whether that's because I believed I didn't deserve help, or I thought that I was a burden, or I just straight up didn't want it because I wanted to do things my way. It's like I tried every way and reason in the book. And at the end of the day, it wasn't until I was desperate enough and willing enough. And that we talk about that a lot in recovery, of like openness, willingness, and open-mindedness, honesty, and willingness, and like that willingness to reach for the connection that I so desperately wanted, but was just terrified of. Like that, those choices have forever altered the course of my life and given me the strength and the courage and the capacity to do the things that help me stay sober and live a life of recovery. And so, yeah, that reaching out and that asking for help is maybe the most important thing.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So glad that we did this.
Yes, me too. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, I really feel like we'll have to do it again at some point, and maybe even just hone in on a specific topic, because I feel like we could talk forever about all of the things.
Yeah, I'm
And we
down.
do.
Yeah.
Just not on the Zooms all the time. Okay, well, I love you so much. Thank you so much for sharing this space with me.
Yes. Thank you for having this space.
Yes. Okay, love you. Bye.